there's some thoughts out there about, you know, the responsibilities of social media platforms and things in terms of the guardrails that they help put in place on their products. I definitely think that's a discussion that has to get pushed further, and because it's such an important time developmentally for kids to then have access to this information, this tool, this weapon, for lack of a better term, in some instances, that they can feel damage from, or can cause damage through. I think it's really overwhelming, even as a consumer. I personally don't use a lot of social media intentionally, because I just made that decision a few years ago, and I think it's just, I look at just the pressures that our young people feel themselves under because of that it's the instant gratification of likes and people responding to that. And I see that in my daughter sometimes. And don't get me wrong, when I was 13 I was very concerned with what my peers, how they felt about me, but I learned how they felt about me in other ways. Right now
it was also contained though, right? Because you had a local population, not a global population of comparison.
That's exactly it, right? And I think that's what's overwhelming about it as a parent. And I feel for the parents in our school system as well because of this, right?
Welcome back to a brand new episode of the HR Heroes podcast, guys. I'm incredibly excited because I've got Eddie Curran here with me today. He's the Chief Human Resources Officer for Round Rock ISD, which is an institution in Texas that is leading us forward when it comes to education and how we approach education. Now, we all know that the education space in itself has been challenged over the last couple of years, and I'm really excited that we've got an HR hero here with us who's really going to give us a landscape of what the future is going to look like in education. So, Eddie, thank you so much for coming to the show, man. Thanks for being here.
It's a great pleasure to be here. I feel a little flattered by being referred to as an HR hero, but I do appreciate it. Thank you, Keenan, for having me here today.
Well, I mean, wouldn't you consider yourself a hero, though? I mean, I think about the landscape of education in general. And one thing that we realize is that the people are more important than ever. And there's people behind the scene, if you will, who are standing up for the people and pushing us forward. And that's what makes you a hero, man.
Well, I appreciate you saying that. And, I think the thing when you work in a leadership role like I do, you're surrounded by great people and you get to interact with great people across an organization. And I like to think of our school district, which is 6,500 employees. I'll say that again, 6,500 employees in a school district. I like to think of us as an ecosystem, and one piece doesn't work without the other piece, right? And so we have, over 150 different position types in our district alone, and every single one of them contributes well. I just get the opportunity to interact and to help shape and lead some of our systems and processes, but it takes all of us, not just our HR staff, but all of our staff in our district to really move things forward for our kids.
I mean, it's really important for us to be able to kind of dive in here. But before we get started here, I want to ask a human-centric question because we're talking about human resources. So, Eddie, how's your heart doing today, man?
How's my heart doing today?
How's your heart doing today?
It's funny you asked that, Keenan. It's important that we take time when we work in HR for ourselves, right? And we really do the things that help us stay centered and focused on our mission and the work that we do. My heart feels pretty good. I went for a run this morning and I worked out after that. So before I ate my breakfast, so that's always a good day for me when I can start that. That's my anchor in the day. And I know if I can do those things and have those good habits in the morning, I'm pretty good. I also got to spend dinner last night with my wife and my daughter and one of our nieces. And so that's always fun when we get that family time. Too often my evenings are, my dinner plans are kind of pushed later in the evenings because of work commitments. And so that's always a good thing. So I'm very blessed to have had that opportunity last night.
It's really interesting to me to be able to open up with that question, because often I feel like we get so into the hustle and bustle of the conversation that we often never, even in this environment, but also in our social environments, never really ask, how are we truly doing? And so I appreciate you, talking about the things that are important to you and being able to spend time with your family and your niece as well, which is really cool. One of the things that we like to do to kind of start off our episodes here is we like to pose a question that came from our previous guest. So this is an individual named Nicole Lowry, and she works for an organization called Quad. They're a global organization, marketing experience company. And her question for you was, how do you navigate the terrain where business objectives don't align with your personal goals or values? And how do you navigate that space? And what tools have been helpful to get you kind of through some of those tough times?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think I'll be honest with you. In the education space, we're so mission driven in terms of student outcomes, and everything that we do is our organizational purpose is truly about those student outcomes. Whether you're a bus driver, whether you're a custodial staff member, whether you're the CFO, it doesn't matter. Our role is to do that. And so that's the competitive advantage I think that we have over private sector industries, is that, we have a tangible outcome that's very much holistic, and it's very much common across the organization. Sometimes we lose sight of the fact that we're here for kids. Every one of us is here for that. But our district does a really good job of a strategic planning process, and really making sure that we're intentionally connecting people into those student outcomes. How I find my peace when those things don't necessarily align is I go back to what's simple, right? I mean, I think we have a framework in our district that is tied to not just, I mean, as I mentioned, student outcomes are our number one priority, but making sure that our staff are positioned in order to be successful, and that the culture reflects that as well. And so I go back to that strategic plan and really focus in on those things, because I think sometimes when you work in a specific department, sometimes HR, when you're really focused on the compliance pieces, or if you're in a legal department or a finance or procurement area, you can really focus on compliance, 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 and you can lose sight of the fact that those compliance pieces, yes, absolutely, they're critical and they're important. But if there are things that you're doing that are a locally developed business practice that is negatively impacting the mission of this organization, then those things need to change. And so I think having that common theme and that common mission in our district really helps us to stay focused on that prize and making sure that we're all aligned to that.
I mean, I feel like that's so beautiful because more so than ever, we need true alignment, especially in an area as important as education. I know in our previous conversation, you had mentioned, in other places where you've worked, we've experienced high levels of respect for individuals like teachers. And it doesn't seem like we kind of get the same stuff here in the United States. But what you said that really stuck out to me was, if we're going to put our trust into anybody, it needs to be the generation that's coming behind us, because they're the people who are going to take care of us. And I feel like over the last years, especially since the pandemic, there's been so much fuss, if you will, about how education is kind of spaced and positioned in our lives. Higher education seems to be getting less and less adoption. It seemed like during the pandemic, we had a lot of trouble with teachers having to be those frontline workers, showing up and dealing with all the challenges of remote schooling, the parents' temperament, how kids were approaching education. And it's a really tough space to be in right now. But before we kind of dive into this stuff, I want to kind of talk about your history in education, because I know you've got some family members who are in other parts of the world being leaders in education as well. So why don't you kind of give us like a level set of kind of your journey into education, some of the things that you've done?
Sure. So before I do that, I just want to touch on the respect thing really quickly. I think, if you don't mind, Keenan, I think it is really important to maintain that positivity in the education space. And it can get hard because there's nothing more personal than people's children, right? At the end of the day, if that's not the most personal thing in your life, then I would question your priorities and your areas of focus, right? That's what's tough. And I don't think anybody has any ill intention towards anybody. I think sometimes it's that frustration that manifests itself in a disrespectful tone, or maybe some abruptness and things like that. And I will also say, having perspective from different countries, we have some, I mean, we have, if you think about it, well, in Texas in particular, the level of support that we have from our parents and our community in my school district and other districts around here, as demonstrated in Friday night football in Texas. It's the highest attended event in any small town in Texas throughout the fall. We've got parents engaged. We've got the parent teacher associations, volunteers. I mean, we're just super fortunate. And so I wanted to make sure I'd address that first, because I think sometimes I want to be careful to not paint all of the system itself as a disrespectful, and I don't feel that way at all. In terms of my own journey, it's interesting. So I have a brother who's a principal. He's a principal in Northern Ireland and has been for a considerable while. I have two sisters who are in education. One works in special education. Actually, they both work in special education for two different schools. My mother was a special education teacher, in addition to a mother of five children, which was its own full time gig, as she tells me all the time. And so it's kind of been a pathway for me. It's also been kind of this commonality for me as I grew up, and that we were surrounded by education, and it was important to my parents. My father was in business, and he worked in private sector for a long time, but he really valued education. Was a very intelligent individual, and really worked hard throughout his life to make the most of himself without a college education. And that just wasn't available to him when he was a young person. So it's been interesting. I've done a lot of things in my life. I've traveled in a lot of different places and had lots of opportunities to experience experience life and culture in different countries, which has been just the biggest eye-opening event, or series of events for me, and the things that have really shaped where I am and the direction of my life and my career today. I taught in Japan. I was a teacher for 3 years over there. I worked in a Japanese high school in the south of Japan. Prior to that, I'd worked in schools in Northern Ireland as a teaching assistant. And then when I came back from Japan, I happened to meet my significant other there. She's from Austin, Texas herself, and that's why I ended up here, because she told me to. So it's one of those things that, education has really helped shape my life, because I went to Japan to teach English in a high school because I wasn't really sure what I was supposed to do with myself at 22 years of age. And I ended up, I met my significant other, and I ended up, you know, forging ahead in a different career. And 20 years later, 25 years later now, sorry, I'm getting older. And so it's really been a great opportunity for me to kind of try and explore different things, but also experience different cultures through education, as you kind of mentioned earlier.
So how do we make the transition into HR? So we know that you're a
Yeah.
teacher at 22 years old in Japan. You meet your girl. You guys move back to, back to Austin, Texas. So what is the process like in kind of making that transition into HR?
I don't know, Keenan. I look at myself every day and I'm asking myself, how did I end up here? So I so when I came to the States, I was 25. So we finished in Japan. I became 20, 25, 26. When I first moved here, I was determined that education wasn't for me. I'd done my thing. I'd enjoyed it. I really enjoyed coaching and things like that, but I wanted to do something different. I looked at my father and the influence that he had on my life. And, I also understood that education was not an area where I was ever going to get rich. And so, not that that was the primary motivating factor, but at 25 years of age, I think we all are keen to make some money and make something of ourselves. And so, land of opportunity, I decided, well, I'm going to try something different. And so I tried a few different things. I ended up working in the hospitality industry, working in hotels and things like that. We tried for a year to live in Maryland. We came back to Texas a year after that. But while I was in Maryland, there's an opportunity for me to try something different and maybe think about moving to New York and really looking at trying to get into the finance industry and things like that. And so we pushed and we tried and we thought about it. And finally, my wife and I, at that point in our careers, we looked at each other and said, this isn't really what we're supposed to be doing with our lives. We're trying really hard and pushing this big rock uphill when it just seems like the rock's destined to turn around and roll over us. So maybe we should go back home to Texas, and education is probably where we need to be. And I think we both were called because, for me particularly, obviously with my family background and the fact that I'd had a lot of success working with students and kids and coaching and different experiences there. And my wife also, she found a lot of value in education. She really related to the kids, and I think the thing that really spoke to us the most was, when you work in a private sector or you're a for profit, there are goals and targets for you, but oftentimes they're numbers based or they're KPIs and things like that. And it's hard to feel around those things, right? It's hard to get that. Like you asked me how my heart was. It's hard to really get inspired. And then you can get inspired if that's your jam, but when you work in education, I mean, you see immediate results with kids, and it's almost like I hate to use this term because I work in HR, but it's almost like a drug. When you see that light bulb go off, or a kid gets it, or even an adult gets it in the education world, it's so, for me personally, that's the reward for me. I love that moment. Um, you know, so I started off. So anyway, long story short, I do short story long a lot, Keenan. Um, Came back to Texas, decided to pursue Texas teacher certification, and I started off working as a teacher in a special education classroom just south of Austin. From there, I moved through the system and became an assistant principal, first at middle school and then at high school level in the Austin area. And finally, when I was a high school assistant principal, I had the opportunity to, I'm very curious. I'm very inquisitive. I like to learn. And so high school assistant principals get a few weeks off in the summer. And well, I got talking to our HR department in the district I was in at the time. And I said, look, I'm really interested in this work and I'd like to learn a little bit more, maybe come over and job shadow you for a couple of weeks to really learn what it is about. Because in school districts, nobody really knows what HR does except for HR, right? I mean, it's just one of the things. And so, well, the executive director of HR at the time kind of took that and ran with it. And before I knew it, I was the coordinator of staffing for that HR department. But yeah, so that's 10 years ago. This was in, sorry, it's almost 11 years ago now. That was in 2013. Um, the opportunity that that has presented to me was, it's kind of, I mentioned earlier, I was looking for ways not to be in education. I was looking for more of that private sector, that business approach, how to systemically be part of something and move the needle, but then also trying to tie that into that student outcome vocational approach, which we get from education. This has been the perfect job for that. I've been able to implement programs. I've been able to learn about the system at large and how we can impact that from every level. Learning about the impact on staffing and compensation and teacher retention and engagement on student outcomes has been just super valuable. And I also think the perspective that I have as a former classroom teacher and as an educator, it gives me a lot more perspective when I have to work, when I get to work with teachers and principals and assistant principals, because, yeah, I'm a little far out of the classroom now, but I've been there and I can speak the language and I understand some of the challenges that they experience on a day-to-day basis. And so this job has just been, it's been a great thing for me. It's allowed me to really, again, really move my career forward and learn a lot, and also learn some different pieces that educators and people in the education industry don't typically get, like even things like strategic planning processes, KPIs, the importance of metrics in HR departments. Those are things that I've learned in this department that are really more aligned to things outside of school district business. So I've been very fortunate. I'm very, very fortunate to be in the role that I'm in today.
It's amazing to me to hear how you've navigated down your own path, being able to kind of find the things that you were interested in, going over to Maryland, thinking about getting into finance, coming back to your roots in education, I feel like is really important. One word that really stuck out to me there was empathy. If you have the ability to empathize with these teachers who are dealing with the navigation and the challenges that come along with being a teacher in today's environment, I feel like puts you in a real position to be successful because you can speak up for their needs. You understand where they're coming from. And when we kind of started our conversation today, I didn't mean to kind of paint a bleak picture of the education space, but it's really tough for me because as an outsider looking in, it seems like the images that social media and everything else kind of throws at education today is a highly volatile, very, aggressive, if you will, environment for teachers to be able to kind of be their best self in. And in our previous conversation, I talked about kind of the revelation that I had during the pandemic, which was parents have kids at home. All the parents are complaining about, hey, it's very difficult for me to be productive and do my normal stuff working at home and having my kids running around. It seems like there would have been an opportunity for us to reflect on what a key role our teachers play in not only supporting our communities, but also raising our kids at the same time. And it seems like, at least from my lens, that our teachers don't get enough respect for exactly what they do. And I know that in our previous conversation, you had mentioned when you're in Japan, the level of esteem that you have as a teacher there is completely different from what we kind of experience over here. Is that true?
Yeah, for sure, and it's very different. I mean, obviously, culturally, it's completely different. I think I think the thing for me that really resonated was, well, firstly in Japan, you know, the way they teach and the way they learn, at least when I was there, was very much what you would have seen in a classroom in the United States probably 30, 40 years ago. You know, it's kids in rows and at lecture style and maybe not as engaging. But the culture was, I mean, the sensei in the classroom was, I mean, that it was the honor system. And so that was truly one of the most honored positions in society. And it goes back to, you know, generations and generations. I mean, sensei um, that's such an honorific term in Japan, and so it's something that's earned, and there is a huge level of respect that goes with that. I think if we think about Hispanic culture as well, it's a similar situation with Hispanic culture where, you know, if the maestro says something and the parents are very respectful and pour into that as well. And so I think culturally you see that across the world. Again, I haven't lived in Finland, but Finland's often held up as a tremendous education system where, you know, things just happen and student success is guaranteed, and they don't have turnover of teaching positions, et cetera, et cetera. And I think one of the things that I've noticed in the United States, at least in my perspective in Texas, I can't speak for the whole country, but um, you know, the career changes that happen in education here don't happen in other countries that I've experienced. My sister will be a teacher till the day she retires. She's not going to change industry. My brother will be a principal till the day he retires. But the chances of a teacher staying in education in Texas now, they're not where they were before, because there are options here for them first and foremost. But there's a reason why also I think that they leave, and there's a lot of research out there as to why teachers leave the profession. I don't want to get into the details on that too much, other than to say there are options here, and you know, in this country, in the area that I live in, I mean, the tech companies that are here now and are based here give options to our teachers, because teachers are some of the most skilled employees that a tech company could hire in terms of the ability to teach, the ability to project manage, the ability to multitask, to meet deliverables, and to be organized. I mean, that's an ideal employee. So, but I think when you say those things and you talk about that skill set, why would you not respect and honor that position and say, my gosh, that is a stellar employee? Like, think about the things that we're asking our teachers to do every day, and the level of expertise that they have in their role, and even if they're a brand new teacher, how quickly they can get up to speed and help young people kind of assimilate the content that they need to. I think it's an amazing job. It's an amazing role, and the fact that it's not held by some people at the level of esteem that it should be, I think that's a great shame. I really do. You know, I have a lot of friends. They don't work in education. They weren't fortunate to land where I landed. I tell them that all the time. They laugh. But so there, I have a friend in Austin. He's an engineer, a really smart guy. And he told me that, you know, one of the things that he believes truly is that, you know, our legislators are responsible for two things: it's infrastructure and education. And those two things, and if they took care of those two things, we'd be in great shape, because we'd be able to get places, and the people who come after us will be able to step into our roles and help us continue to thrive as a state and a nation. And I thought that was really informative, and also it's a great perspective, because he's informed himself and taken steps to learn about what goes on in the school system, et cetera, et cetera. But he's also an employer, and he's concerned about, where's my workforce? Where are they coming from? Like, I'm around for the next 20, 25 years in his role, but what comes after that, and how do I ensure the sustainability of my business or my organization in the future? Your teachers do that. They help you do that, right? And so I think that to me is a bit of a disconnect right now, is that we have, um, you know, from an HR perspective, part of my role is workforce planning and making sure our workforce is set up correctly. Well, our first workforce and our future workforce, they're right here in our school system, you know? And so I think we have to create those opportunities to create not just the connections for our students in terms of that workforce, but also to make sure that our communities, organizations, and businesses in the surrounding area and beyond are really bought into that, and really understand and get why it's important, and are also advocating for public education from that perspective, right? And I think sometimes that doesn't happen, but we need more of that, because at the end of the day, if we can't get our businesses on board, well, we can continue to, we'll continue to be successful because we've got great teachers who are, and great principals and school systems that will continue to see kids graduate from high school. But are they going to be ready, and are we connected to the skills that are going to be needed in 10, 15, 20 years time in workforces, in workplaces rather, and in companies and organizations that don't exist today, right? I mean, if we think about the last 20 years and the changes that have happened, um, the skill set that we're teaching kids right now, um, I, I guess we're trying to create malleable individuals who can plug in whatever industry. I think that's what we're trying to do. But we also need to make sure that I think our businesses and our organizations and the communities that we live in, they also have vested interest and a responsibility to make sure that all of those things are successful and are well aligned to the needs of the community that we're in.
Yeah, I mean, the analogy in my head kind of went to a farmer. I was thinking about planting seeds, right? But not paying attention to the soil quality. You cannot grow harvest crops from soil that is not rich. And it seems like we're kind of misstepping when it comes to investing into the right elements of our teachers and into the education system. Because what is going to happen to the future workforce?
Yeah.
It's a really interesting dynamic to kind of run out in your head. If we don't have good teachers leading students to show them the future, then when they come into the workforce, they're going to be underprepared. They're not going to know what's going on. And it's going to put our workforce in a really tough situation in the future, which is a really interesting concept. But I haven't really thought about it like that until you started mentioning that.
Yeah, and I think that's what really HR and school districts, I think we're having to stretch ourselves now, because not only like we talk about a teacher shortage, but we have shortages in other positions too. I mentioned 6,500 employees earlier. And not everybody in our school system wants to be a teacher when they grow up or when they finish high school and college. But there are lots of other positions that we do have in our school district. But our first employees, I mean, we're lucky in our district. There's almost 500 of our employees currently are former Round Rock ISD high school, or Round Rock ISD graduates rather, which is cool. That's really, really awesome. I love that. That's a great statistic for me. But there are a lot of other opportunities that we have that we can't fill, and I'm not sure we're connecting our students or looking at our students as potential former or future employees for those roles. And I think as HR professionals, that's where our work really is evolving now, because we've really got to get more. It used to be for school districts, you go to university job fairs and there's 200 people applying for every position that you post, et cetera, et cetera. Those days are done. That's not happening anymore. And so we have to really kind of think long term about how do we look in different areas, but also create intentional programs that actually help develop and grow those future teachers and future employees in other positions as well.
I mean, what qualities do you think the future teacher needs to start developing from a skill set perspective to meet the new students in this new generation? I mean, I automatically kind of think about how technology is exponentially increasing in front of us. And it seems like some of our societal legacy systems, like higher education and education in general, aren't adapting at that same pace. And so what's your kind of your 2 cents on what's needed for the future?
I think that's a really good call out. It's just so hard to keep up with technology. I mean, it's an almost impossible task, because education systems are tied to budgets and are tied to
Hmm.
legislation, which in Texas, our legislators only meet every 2 years, and so that's a challenge for us, right? And so how do we keep up with the pace of that? But I think good teaching is good teaching. I mean, at the end of the day, we've got amazing teachers already who are doing a lot of the things um, that I think we've got to be preparing students for. So the first thing that comes to mind is critical thinking. I mean, um, in my day, I make myself sound old. I'm going to say my father's day, not in my day. In my father's day, those students would sit there and they would absorb the content from their teacher. Right? It's content and it's facts, and this is when this happened, et cetera, et cetera. They don't need teachers for that information anymore. Like you said, it's on their phone. They can go do that. And so our really adept teachers, they do what's called flip in the classroom, where they ask the students to go do the research outside, and then they come in, and the classroom becomes a critical think tank, right? Where we're actually going to go process through the information and synthesize it, and then really interpret it, analyze it. That's the skill set that we need, because critical thinking is that's industry transferable, right? You don't have, it's not something that's specific to one industry or one type of workforce. So I think that's the first thing. The second thing is communication, and you talked when we met last time. We talked about social media, and um, I talked to you about the challenges of raising a 13-year-old daughter, and her first communication tool is this. Her second is face to face with me. So
Yeah.
so it's just those things as well. Is that we can't lose sight of the fact that face to face interpersonal communication is that's what brings you to the dance. I mean, at the end of the day, as you can tell, I don't mind chatting. I don't mind talking. I'm pretty verbose. My wife said, but part of that comes with just years of work, living in different cultures, and just meeting different people, and getting the opportunity to do job interviews on both sides of the table, and just those experiences. It also comes from the fact that when I was my daughter's age, I didn't have this to look at, so I was forced to get my information or my engagement through interpersonal reactions, going hanging out with buddies or whatever that looked like. So I think that's a big piece, and I think we've got to create that intentional opportunity for our students to have that dialogue and interaction at school, and we've also got to teach them, the importance of not just interpersonal communication, but just communication at different levels, like professional communication versus how I'm going to talk to my buddy versus how I'm going to talk in a business meeting, right? There's different levels to that too. I think those are the two things that spring to mind. And I know last time we talked about social media and some of the challenges that come along with that. I think one of the things that sticks in my head as a parent, maybe from that perspective, is just the importance of making sure my daughter knows that just because it's on social media, it does not make it truth, right? And that's where that critical thinking comes in. It's like, don't take the first thing and don't respond to the first thing that you read. You've got to really think through that, process through that, and then really align that to your own value system in terms of how you want to respond. But the second piece to that is you don't always have to respond. And if you do respond, it doesn't have to be immediate, right? Give yourself some space and time, and think through that. And I think those are some skills that occasionally, when you see social media battles, and you see, you know, Twitter, whatever it's called now, you see Twitter spats, things like that. I think that's where our first response is to respond rather than to stop, think, and then act, right? And so those are some skills that I think it's challenging for our teachers to build those in with intention, because they do have a lot of pressures in terms of, I mean, our ultimate goal is to graduate every student from high school, and there are certain things that they have to do in order to get that. But we've got to really find opportunities to give students as many chances to do those types of things as we can during the instructional day, but then also beyond that. So I think the thing as well is to really make sure that that students understand the importance and gain some sense of intrinsic motivation to go out and do that themselves too, right? So um, hopefully that answered your question.
Yeah, man. I mean, it sounds like a heck of a challenge for somebody who is coming into this space. I mean, when we were talking a little bit earlier, I was thinking about the skill set of being a teacher. When you're talking about being able to control and influence a room of, let's call it 28 to 35 kids, being able to stand up, gain control, respect, and then influence these individuals to learn certain subjects and get cohesion is an amazing skill set. So coming into other areas of opportunity, like we talked about, like tech businesses, being able to kind of draw teachers out of the education system is a huge threat. And it's a really interesting concept to me that the competitive nature of teachers and the skill sets that they develop make them incredibly valuable. And going back to the respect conversation, we should highly respect these individuals for the things that they can accomplish and the influence that they have on the next generation. I want to dive into the social media conversation a little bit because I thought that was really interesting. This is a new challenge that students and all of our societies having to deal with. The ability to, I would say, discern information from being popular and being right to being authoritative and being popular, I think is an interesting dynamic. I was listening to a podcast not too long ago where they were talking about Gen Z and Alpha specifically are going to have to hone the skill set of challenging information for actually being legitimate. And I'm glad that you kind of talked on that point of how you're influencing your daughter to say, hey, slow down and let's make a good decision because mistakes love a rushed decision.
Yeah.
What do you think about kind of this new element of popularity being confused for authority with all the information overload that we have today and the
Yeah.
influence that it has?
I think it's really I think it's really overwhelming even as a consumer. Personally don't use a lot of social media intentionally because I just made that decision a few years ago, um, and I think it's just I look at just the pressures that our young people feel themselves under because of that it's the instant gratification of likes and people responding to that, and I see that in my daughter sometimes. And you know I mean, don't get me wrong, when I was 13 I was very concerned with what my peers, how they felt about me, but it just I learned how they felt about me in other ways. Right
It was
now
also contained though,
it was
right? Because you
content.
had a local
Yeah,
population, not a global population of
that's exactly
comparison.
it, right? And I think that's what's overwhelming about it as a parent. And I I feel for the parents in our school system as well because of this, right? Because those kids are in the hive during the day. I mean, it's the hive and the hub, and so they're getting the interpersonal piece to that as well. Which, did you hear what such and such said? But then they're also getting it, like you say, on social media. But also, yeah, I think it's a really good call out, like that extension beyond just their local community, and the impact that that can have as well. So I think it's just it's really difficult, and it's really hard to. I wish I could fix that, and I had the right answer to it. But I think as a parent, the thing that's important to me is just to really talk with our kids and make sure that the message is consistent in the schools as well, man, about it's really about critical thinking on what you do with it, right? And how you value yourself. So we do a lot of things with social emotional learning in schools as well. My wife's an elementary school counselor. She tells me all about it, and really prepping those kids to, it's yes, it's really important to communicate through this social media tool, but the like button is not it's not a sense of value for you, and trying to think beyond the gratification that you're getting with people liking what you said, or liking your picture or whatever that looks like, versus how you feel intrinsically about yourself. As a young person, I struggled with that, Keenan, as well. I mean, I think a lot of us did. It really took me into my 20s before I was comfortable in my own skin and really knew who I was. And, I didn't really, at some point, you get to a point in your life where it's like, well, it's great what other people think about me. But, at the end of the day, I got to look myself in the mirror, and I'm the only one who knows who's in my head. And so that doesn't come overnight. And I think it's really difficult. There's some thoughts out there about, you know, the responsibilities of social media platforms and things in terms of the guardrails that they help put in place on their products. I mean, I definitely think that's a discussion that has to get pushed further, and because it's such a an important time developmentally for kids to then have access to this information, this tool, this weapon, for lack of a better term, in some instances that they can feel damage from, or can cause damage through. It's definitely something that has to be at the front and center of all of our heads as members of society, I think.
I feel like there's an interesting dichotomy to that as well, because social media in itself kind of is like the tubes of communication. But what we're really seeing through these platforms is kind of a reflection, because you use that word, of society in general. And it's interesting to kind of see what happens when people get behind a keyboard and they can just be their truest version of themselves, how they reach out, how they pick on people, how they encourage, how they lift up others. It's almost like we're seeing social media as a mirror. And I don't think I mean, I do agree that there are certain responsibilities from these platforms and how they kind of design the engagement elements and how they do notifications and all that kind of stuff. But I also feel like there's a societal element where we have to take some accountability and responsibility to be better people on these platforms too.
I think that's fair. I think and that's a big thing too, right? Where it's a lot easier to just click send than it is to confront somebody with words, right? And so I definitely agree with you. I think as a society, I'm a pretty positive person. I think I have my days, but I'm a pretty positive person in general. I try to keep things light at work. I try to keep things light at home, and with a sense of humor and things like that, because life's hard, and it things can get to you, and the things that we have to navigate and deal with are not always fun, right? It's very true. So having that positive culture is really, really important. I think it's also, though, important to kind of call out that, with social media, or with how we communicate on the keyboard, or on the phone, those types of things, that's something that can be taught to a certain extent, but somebody can also have a bad day and can just see something they don't like and then just respond to it. So there's definitely some skill around social media responsibility that can be taught. Um, but I agree with the accountability piece to that too. At some point you have to look yourself in the mirror and say, it's like when you don't send the email when you're upset, or it's the same concept, right? Okay, take a break. You're probably not in the right place now, and so let's come back and think about that in the morning. Put it in your drafts or whatever. And I think it's the same concept, because people, by um, one thing we talk about in our department a lot is, HR people like checklists, and they like to check things off. Well, people like to respond, because it's, especially when this becomes like tasks that you're doing. Well, I responded to that, or and so it's that mindset where we're quick to respond because we've done it now. And, whereas I think there's not this. I think we have to teach people that it's okay to not have that same sense of urgency when it comes to things like um, communication that may have some impact, like you talked about.
One of the things I really want to kind of dive into, that I am really interested in your perspective is I also consider myself an optimist. I've also come under fire, if you will, over the last years for being toxically positive.
Mm.
And so, one of the things I think is interesting in our society is when people are positive, we talk about them being toxic because they look at things with a positive outlook, which is an interesting area of conversation as well. But what I've been doing is I've been messing around with a framework in my mind recently called practical optimism. And I want to kind of get your 2 cents on practical optimism, because practical optimism, from my perspective, is being able to control how I react to a situation. Meaning, there's life comes at us hot and heavy all the time. Lots of stuff is not going to go our way. But being able to be practical about the current situation and then choosing to respond in an optimistic frame, being able to look at the positive side or look at how we're going to respond in this way in an optimistic attitude, I feel like is really important. What's your kind of 2 cents on that practical
Yeah,
optimism
I
framework?
love that. I think it's. I mean, it's a great way to look at it. My wife. It reminds me of my wife's like that. I mean, she's very, very just a positive person all the time. She just is such a great influence, because, she just doesn't let life get to her. Now, my wife's also a scientist, and she she has a very interesting perspective on life, where she said, we're made from the same matter as the dirt that's on the ground. So she'll explain things out like that. And so I think sometimes it's important that we remember to have that perspective as well, right? There are there are a lot of us on this planet, and the things that we're dealing with, and that we're doing on a day-to-day basis, a lot of them absolutely will be memorable, but some of them won't, right? And so I told you earlier, I like to keep things as light as possible, particularly in an HR department. I think that's important. We deal with some tough stuff sometimes. I think our work is serious, but we can't be too serious about it. We can't let it be, I think there has to be some recognition of the fact that we're here doing the very best that we can. Um, everybody's doing the best that they can with the tools and resources that they have available to them. And I think as a society, we have to, I think I don't have any issue with people being positive. I don't understand that mindset. I think, sure, sometimes it could be a little annoying, but I mean, I'm Northern Irish. That's the way our culture is. We're quite cynical as a people. So, but I think somebody described it to me one time as just presuming positive intent at all times, right? If you presume positive intent at all times, I think that helps a lot, because it gives you that frame of reference anytime you have an interaction with another individual. And I think that's the sort of thing that can pay it forward to somebody else, because if you presume positive intent and then you give somebody the grace who's maybe not having the best day, well, the chances are that that's something that's going to mean something to that person, and it could impact their next interaction, right, or the way that they approach future in the future. The other thing I talked to you about previously, well, I think I did actually, was the importance of reps, right? Reps and muscle
Hmm.
memory. I'm a great, I love to train, I love to work out, but I've learned my job through lots and lots of reps of doing it. I think if you continue to presume positive intent and you continue to do that and earn reps and get reps, then over time that becomes innate in you, right? And that's just the way that you approach things. And so, I think unfortunately what it's going to take is it's going to take some people having that mindset and others maybe won't be bought into it, but you've got to keep going, right? You got to keep pushing, and because that's how society changes. It's a groundswell, right? Because it's not going to happen with one person making the decision to follow that path, and so, but it's very interesting. It's challenging in a large organization, but I think that's what you described is an excellent approach that I think we as school systems, and I include our community in that as well. We have to take that approach. If we take that approach and we presume positive intent and we try to treat things as positively as possible, then the only people who are going to benefit from that are our students, right? So that should be
And
the
that's
goal.
important. Yeah, absolutely. Well, I want to give you the last couple seconds here to kind of paint a picture, if you will. What does the future of HR, especially in education, look like for you?
Yeah, so I think HR is you know, in school districts, HR can be looked at a certain way. I mean, here comes the compliance people, or the rule makers and things like that. I think HR, when it comes to humans, I mean, there there is no more important thing in a school system than the humans who are in it, right? And so I think we've got a really, really important role to think strategically about how the organization is moving, particularly as we haven't really touched on our multi-generational workforce today, but as generations change and the priorities of those generations change, it's important for people like me to have a pulse on that, make sure that we're creating intentional feedback loops so we can get that information, but then also not just get the information, but synthesize it in the system and make it actionable for leaders in our district. The goal would be obviously to make sure that we create a space that has a sustainable workforce in future years, and that means that not just looking at this hiring season or at this particular school year, but actually thinking 5, 10 years from now. Um, Not only are we going to have the people to come and step into the roles that we currently have, but are we also creating the platform for them to have the skill set where they'll be successful in those roles as well.
One of my really good friends who was on the podcast previously is a guy named Chris Gillett, and he held a human resources role at DHL on a global scale. And he talked about, Keenan, before there was HR, before there were all the other acronyms like DE and I, we need to remember that there were human beings who cared. And that's kind of where I feel like we need to get back to, is just that humanistic nature of showing up for people the best that we possibly can with an optimistic attitude every single day and seeing the ripple effects that creates in the future. And I'm super excited because I know that there are leaders out there like you, Eddie, who are making that kind of stuff happen by doing the small stuff every single day and having a huge impact on not only the teachers who are influencing the next generation, but the next generation as a secondary effect of that. As we kind of wrap up here today, I want to give you the opportunity to pose a question for our next guest. What would you like to ask them?
How are you preparing your organization for people who aren't yet in your organization?
I love that. Well, guys, once again, thank you so much for tuning into the HR Heroes podcast. Eddie, thank you so much for all the work that you're doing. And thank you so much for bringing so much value to the conversation today. I really appreciate it.
Very
That's
welcome,
a wrap.
Keenan, and thank you for the opportunity, sir. All the best.